Good afternoon and good evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to a celebration of Brian Wickham, regardless of where you are in the world. My name's Hadley Wickham, and as you might guess from my name and possibly the background on my Zoom, I'm Brian's son, and it's my great privilege to host this conference today, celebrating some of the many achievements of Brian over the course of his career. Before we get started with the conference, I'd just like to say a big thank you, firstly to all of the speakers today, but to also all of you who have registered and shared such kind words and wonderful memories of Dad in the registration form. We have read them all, and it's really been heartwarming to hear what a wonderful positive impact Dad has had over the course of his life. So please feel free to keep sharing, the thoughts and the memories. Dad always loves to get emails, but you're also welcome to use the chat and the webinar today. So I'm sure many of you have attended a discussion or a meeting chaired by Dad in the past, and if anything, I am a brisker chair than he is. So we'll be keeping things to a pretty tight schedule today. And Dad has warned me specifically about some of you. So on a completely unrelated note, I'd love to welcome Andrew Cromie and Sean Coughlin to kick off the conference by speaking to Dad's and their experience in the first 14 years setting up ICBF. So Andrew and Sean, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hadley, and good evening, everybody from a warm, humid Bandon in County Cork. Hadley, I'm going to share my screen if that's okay, and hopefully you can.
Good morning and good evening to everyone as well from Andrew here.
Okay, so you can see that, Hadley. It's a blank screen, hopefully.
Yep, we're good to go.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so good evening, everybody, and Andrew and I will be taking you through a few slides here. Hopefully, we won't do death by PowerPoint here tonight, but just a few slides to give a story here as to Brian's some memories from Brian's journey. And I suppose starting out, a blank page is probably not the most unfitting place to start, because that's what Brian actually came to Ireland. He had a blank page, and it was a daunting task for many, but not for Brian, because Brian brought with him two very, very key elements that were critical for the success of this very ambitious endeavor. One was a very clear vision as to what he wanted for cattle breeding in Ireland, and that has been and remains the why for ICBF. The second one was he brought Alison, who was a rock throughout the entire adventure. Now, let me just say, hopefully this moves on. So, two key elements, and look, we're going to work our way through the years, and I'm going to take a few, and Andrew is going to take a few. The first thing, I suppose, as I said, we started in 1998. And I think Brian had in the collage there beforehand had this cartoon as well up from the Farmers Journal, and it's John Malone from the Department of Agriculture wishing Brian the best of luck. And what was clear, at the start was we had a very passionate cattle breeding industry here in Ireland, but also trenchant in many ways in terms of how we did business and so on. So Brian was starting with no structure, there was no office location, no staff, no governance. No rules, no funding. What could possibly go wrong? And in the following 2 years, through lots of perseverance and of course lots of good help from many others in the industry, but that unrelenting drive from Brian, we've ended up with a structure that ended up with the shareholding as it is there on the screen, and I'm not going to go into it, and 16 board members, and you'd say, well, goodness, how the name of goodness can we get anything done with 16 board members? But what Brian put in place with the other board members and the other organizations at that time, and has stood the test of time, and 23 years later, this structure still serves us very, very well. And from the very start, Brian saw the importance of having everybody involved and saw the key role of having the department. And John Malone was key in the early days there in terms of chairing the organization, in terms of having the department involved because of the investment in long-term cattle breeding is a long-term business. And Brian never lost sight of the vision that cattle breeding was a long-term business and it would take time. So that was 1998 to about 2000. And then in 2001, we started with the EBI.
So yes, Brian, you'll remember that project. That was our first really big project from an ICBS standpoint. I was just out of college in 1988 whenever ICBS started. In fact, I was at that ICAR Interbull conference. I saw Mike McGann and a few Irish people there. Brian, I was at that conference and you and I had a chat, and really out of that then I became, I think it was the third employee, or sorry, well, after Mary Madden and yourself, and we started with this very big project. Sean made an important point there about drawing on others for help. And we got a lot of help at that stage from Teagasc that had certainly identified some of the challenges that we had in our breeding indexes and our breeding program. And as a consequence of that, it was certainly you the idea, well, we need to get outside help. We need to get the best in the world to come and help us develop this index. And you put together a team. I was the sort of the whippersnapper, just trying to cajole and pull it along. But we had Ron Veerkamp and Pat Dillon and others from Wageningen at that stage as well. And that really got the whole EBA moving. And I know Peter Amer, John O'Sullivan and others will talk about that at a later stage. So that was the EBA project.
So moving on then to 2002, and the database was launched, and we uploaded the IHFA and got the Holstein Friesian herd book running. And of course, there were some initial challenges. This was a massive database project. There were lots of challenges with cleaning and combining data from different sources, which of course was the whole point of the exercise. And if it was easy, we wouldn't have needed Brian. But despite the challenges, Brian always remained positive. There was a vision to be achieved. The next couple of years, again, remained focused on migrating the various databases. So in 2003, we did the milk recording work. And in 2004, we migrated all the different breed herd book data to the beef herd book data to the central database. Again, it was a major piece of work. There were 16 different herd books. And again, there was both a technical aspect to it, and also there was a change management and very much a people aspect. Many were wondering what centralizing the data would mean for their future. Again, it wasn't all plain sailing, but there was a vision to be achieved, and this was part of the journey. And as it turns out, those herd books have had nothing to worry about in terms of what was going to happen by coming to the central database. So we move on to 2005.
And in 2005, this was in many ways the follow-on to the EBA project, because in that initial project, we had two elements, the index and the breeding program. But we didn't pick up the breeding program piece until 2005, again with Roll and then with help from Peter Amer and others. But the key objective here was, look, we have this database now, we have this index. It just doesn't make sense not to be identifying the best cows, the best calves in Ireland and getting them progeny tested. And that's how we're going to generate genetic gain. Because before that, we were very much driven off, the top sires were really coming from imported sires from foreign breeding programs, and your view on that was that we'll find some of these better bulls, but if we want to have improvement year on year, we really need to be sourcing them from the ICBF database to find these really outlier bulls, and that's what has helped. That green line you can see in 2005, there was no Irish bull in the top 2000. In the top 75. By the time we hit 2017, you can see they're all young Irish bred bulls, obviously helped by genomics along the way as well, but we picked that up in a few slides time.
So two further major projects again in 2006. One of the things that had been happening since we had launched the services from the database in 2002 was that the reports had been going out at no charge and for free. And we were using the resources of the organization to do that. The challenge was that the more successful Brian was in terms of increasing the uptake, the more money was lost. Thus, we had to change to a subscription model, and Brian led that changing, and we launched the Herd Plus service, subscription-based service in September of 2006. which was a major initiative for the organization and continues to serve us extremely well today in terms of our ability to service farmers with the reports and the information that they need. And also then in 2006, the AI handhelds were rolled out successfully to the technicians, AI technicians across the country. Prior to that, everything had been recorded on paper dockets. Subsequently, most of it keyed. Again, invariably, the data quality was less than ideal. And again, what Brian led there in 2006 was a major technology project, but also there was lots of change management at the technician and the AI company admin level. So 2007, Andrew?
2007, then having endured the EBA rollout and all the challenges that brought, we then moved to, in many ways, an even bigger and daunting task, which was to first of all bring multi-trade evaluations in on beef using commercial data. And with that, then also the suckler beef index. And, you know, again, Roland, Peter will remember this work and those projects fondly, because you know, there was a lot of industry engagement, a lot of herd book meetings, a lot of industry meetings, a lot of people very upset because, you know, traditionally the model for pedigree beef breeding around the world, whether it's in the US or in New Zealand or Australia or France, had been all based on within breed selection, within breed genetic evaluations. And here was this New Zealander going to come to Ireland and use commercial data, carcass data and calving and fertility data on non-pedigree animals and have multi-breed genetic evaluations and then put it all together into an overall profit index. And, you know, that caused a lot of consternation. You can see breeds in row with ICBF. I can assure you there was lots of rows, lots of good vigorous discussions, but the reality of it is, and where we've gotten to in beef, it's a very, very positive outcome. And I know Peter's going to talk a nice bit more about that later on. But I did this with a small bit of work actually for Rob Banks there and Steve Miller only a few weeks ago, because they're looking at doing multi-breed evaluations now in Australia, and they wanted to get some reference point in terms of what's the increase in genetic gain as a consequence to moving to multi-breed. Ours was all within breed prior to Brian arriving. And you can see, well, our rates again have gone up by about 50% for the terminal traits in across all of those main breeds. So again, just sticking to the science, understanding the data, the principles has really driven us to a much, much better place in beef. And as I said, Peter will pick that up again later.
And also as part of those discussions and those many difficult discussions we have, there was a couple of things that Brian always managed to do. One is he was always assuming positive intent. If anybody was showing any bit of positivity, he would latch onto it. And the second thing is, no matter how difficult the meeting was, Brian would always come back from the meeting and emphasize the one or two little nuggets of positivity in a meeting that he might have been, you know, gotten a real tough time. He actually came, and the only thing he would focus on was the couple of positives that would just keep the thing moving forward, which was you know, and look, it's something that inspired us all. 2008, well, 2008 was a quiet year. Of course, it wasn't. Brian was continuing to drive three, I would say, major events in 2008. The first one was, and this was a real, I suppose, game changer for data on the beef side. The Department of Agriculture launched the Suckler Cow Welfare Scheme. It was a game changer on the beef data side because we now had 50,000 commercial beef herds initially signing up. And not all ended up participating fully, but we ended up with 40,000 herds participating actively. But it was a major vote of confidence in Brian's leadership to deliver a national scheme of this scale, that the department would trust ICBF to deliver this and try and bring, because the focus had been for the first number of years until 2007, as Andrew mentioned there, the focus had been in terms of actually, you know, being focused on the dairy side, getting the database up, and you know, in fairness, the beef folks were saying, well, what about us? And the department wrote in with a scheme that has been a precursor to a number of subsequent schemes, but this was a major game changer on the beef side. Of course, not everything was running smoothly. We had an IBR outbreak at Tully Performance Test Centre, where we had, you know, a couple of sheds of pedigree bulls that tested positive for IBR. And, you know, but again, one of the things that Brian was unbelievable at was taking the nuggets, taking the positivity, And we turned a difficult situation, and Brian turned a difficult situation into a great story with the conversion of Tully into a commercial testing facility. We decided not to put pedigree bulls back in there and face the same risks that have been there. And we turned it, Brian turned it into a commercial animal testing facility where it's much easier to gather data. And now we're gathering, probably it's the largest methane gathering facility in the world at the moment, again, arising out of the response to a difficult situation that Brian had. The third thing in 2008, which again was very significant and continues to be a great success, was Brian was asked to take over, and would he actually launch a sister of ICBF on the sheep side, and so Sheep Ireland was born. It was a legally separate entity. It has its own board and so on. And Brian was also the first Sheep Ireland CEO. So again, nothing much going on in 2008 except three major initiatives, and that were delivered.
And obviously, throughout all of this time, Brian was still very much involved in ICAR and Interbull, and Martin's going to pick up that next, Martin and Matt. But he was also very keen that we would increasingly get an engagement with those organisations. So the staff, the likes of myself, Ross Evans, Dunnaberry, these, in terms of our attendances at these conferences, and sensing that there was something significant happening in and around 2000 and 2008 and 2009, he encouraged a considerable number of the board members to also attend the ICAR conference in Niagara Falls, and John O'Sullivan, our chairman, who will also speak, was at that conference. And of course, it was a seminal conference because it was effectively the launch of genomics. And after that, you put the pieces in place to get a momentum really around the implementation of genomics, with our industry all working closely together. And we launched genomics then in conjunction with Teagasc. Donna was very heavily involved in that work at that stage, along with others, to launch genomics, which really has given us the platform for our continued genetic gain that we've been able to achieve over this last 10, 15 years.
And in 2011, there was, as Andrew mentioned there, in 2007, new beef index had launched, and maybe it didn't quite get the traction we were hoping, and there was a difference. So again, Brian was more than happy to make a slight change in direction, use the infrastructure that we had, use the data that was gathered from the suckler scheme and all of that data that was coming in. And in 2011, a lot of the groundwork was done for the development of the separating out of the terminal and replacement index on the suckler side. And we're getting ready for the launch of the Eurostar indexes. Again, a major piece of work, lots of collaboration with industry. And again, that has been the bedrock of the suckler beef, breeding piece for the last 10 years. Really stood the test of time. The second thing there, which Brian was absolutely crucially involved in as well, was Animal Health Ireland was starting up at that time. Again, somewhat on the same premise and on the same, using the template that ICBF had been established. And Mike McGann, who I know is on here tonight, was chair of that organisation and was absolutely crucial to getting it set up. But one of the things that Brian did was worked with Mike and Joe Flaherty at the time, to partner with them to make sure that ICBF provided offered and provided the back-end database for the support of the National BVD program, which ultimately saved farmers and the industry a lot of time and money in the process. So we move on to 2012, and I'm conscious of time here, Hadley. I'm just going to do a very brief check here. Sorry. Yeah, so we have a few minutes. Okay, so 2012, and I saw, Brian, that you had this in your collage earlier. ICAR was staged in Cork in May 2012. It was a major undertaking, showcasing where Ireland had come from over the previous 14 years, and where it had got to. And it really was a festival of Irish agriculture, with the visits to farms, and also the weather really played its part when we did a food festival evening in the Rochestown Park, and it really was a great culmination in terms of everything that was good over the previous 14 years. So then we move on to 2013 in terms of the lasting legacy, and I suppose there's a few things here, and I'm not going to cover this because I know John O'Sullivan and Michael and some others will be covering some of this, but there are 3 points I suppose I just wanted to raise. Firstly, in terms of the legacy, Brian, you had this photo up as well as from our 20th anniversary in 2018, and the bedrock of the organization being the staff and the people. And Brian, you were the one that put that in place. The second thing was the database, in terms of the central database. Not many like it around the world, if any, continues to serve us really well. And the third thing, Brian, is in terms of ultimately the delivery on the ground, because you can do all the fancy stuff, but Brian, you never, ever, ever lost sight of it was delivery. It was in-point delivery to farmers on the ground in terms of looking after the economic well-being of Irish dairy and beef farmers, and that was the key. So on that side. So I'm more or less there, Hadley. I have one more slide, because I was going through some stuff over the last couple of weeks, and I came across this, and you know, I just couldn't help but feel that it was worth bringing up, right? So it's a quote from Theodore Roosevelt, and I'm going to read it out to you and put it up on the screen and read it out, and we leave it at that. It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Brian, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian.
Thanks, Sean and Andrew. That was lovely. So next, I'm gonna stop the screen and spotlight you. Oops, sorry. Spotlight you. So next up, we have Richard Spelman and the LIC team, who's going to talk about Dad's life at LIC, 1975 to 1997, and more recently, once he came back to New Zealand in 2019.
Yep, thank you, Hadley. So welcome everybody to New Zealand, morning here. So we'll talk about the years before Brian got across there to Ireland. So just give a little context of people around the world. So here in New Zealand at the moment, so we have come together in Hamilton. So there's about 60 of us here having breakfast. So just sharing this as a group, and as we will enjoy listening to the story of Brian. So Brian started, well, actually we think Brian started in 1972. So Jack Hooper's found back in Farm Production Division, but it was very short term. It was only probably a month or three before Brian then left the Farm Production Division, which was part of the New Zealand Dairy Board. And that would have been between his Masters and PhD. And I'm sure Brian will correct me if I'm wrong on this one. So at that stage, so certainly the Farm Production Division was part of the New Zealand Dairy Board. It was a group that then came up here to Newstead, and I think in the late 70s, and then became the Farm Production Division, joined up with some of the livestock improvement associations, and then we became Livestock Improvement. And there's a couple of logos there that we can see. So Brian at that stage, I mean, here's a photo right back in the era, some very key people to us as LIC, so Jeff Stitchbury, Hugh Clifford, and on the very far side, Pat Shannon. So Brian was part of, and Tony Rumble's there as well, and the other one is Harold Skyvold from Norway, which really showed, I think, at that early stage of the team that we had and the sort of interaction that Brian had internationally, which was certainly continued through, and is really a legacy of what Brian has done, is bringing teams together, especially from an international perspective, which was very important from New Zealand, where we are geographically based. So we will pass across to, there'll be three of us will talk on this here. So Rachel and Bevan will also speak, and we'll talk about three different things. So we'll talk about the national database. Andrew and Sean have talked about the database, the legacy that Brian's left behind in Ireland, but certainly we have the same here. Bevan will talk about breeding worth, so the index that's being left here as well, and we currently have. And then I'll talk about our genomics work.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, looking at those slides from ICBF brought back a few memories for me too, because you know, if it wasn't for Brian, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to work over there. So I really appreciate that opportunity when it was given to me. So yes, I'm going to sort of talk about the early years of Brian at LIC. It is pre my time, so it was actually quite interesting working through all the archives and trying to pull a bit of information about here. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the establishment of the national database. At the time, you know, as I say, I was actually still at high school. And actually probably in those days, actually probably primary school, get it right. And but it's really important that this has really set us up for where we are today. You know, and the development of the database was a huge improvement on the way data had been stored and the accessibility of data to the industry. And in Brian's words, from an article that I found, it was an information processing revolution, and it really was. And this is just an image of them setting up the database at LIC in the mid-1980s. And as you can see there, the development actually commenced in 1979. So it was actually a real huge undertaking to get the database set up. And it allowed for all known details on farms, farmers, animals to be stored in one place rather than across multiple tapes that had to be collected out of storage, then loaded onto computers before it was made accessible to those that were wanting to use it and then have conversations with farmers. So the major objectives of the new database was to reduce turnaround time, to increase reporting flexibility, and to give accuracy control to regional officers. And those three things are still things that we strive for today. It's interesting reading through and looking at you know, the turnaround times back then in terms of the data being collected on farm, made available to LICA, punched and onto the tapes, and then data provided back to farmers was 14 days. I don't think there'd be too many farmers out there today if they were, you know, if they were getting that sort of turnaround. A lot of farmers expect 14 minutes, let alone 14 days. And Brian played a real integral role as part of this process. You know, so with the development of any good database, you need to develop accurate data descriptions of all the different data types that are made up by the activities back then of LICA, the farm production system and the breed societies. So, you know, it's not an easy undertaking to be able to collate all that information. And I was hoping to be able to drag out a paper copy of the big old data dictionary booklet, but unfortunately I wasn't able to get hold of one. And obviously among many of the other activities that would have been going on around this stage, education to the industry of the changes would have been a critical role. And Brian took this, I imagine, took this with ease, really. I mean, it just flows on from what ICBF were just talking about in terms of his engagement with the industry, setting up ICBF. So it's, yeah, it's, it just comes natural to him. And in this particular photo, which was from 1985, you got Brian talking to a group of LICA staff explaining about the new database, the supporting software, and how this will impact on their roles at LICA and their engagement with farmers. And this is just the headlines of just a small number of articles that we were able to find during that era in terms of that education extension from Brian in his role really trying to get across the value of the data to the industry, and in particular around the need for accuracy, and then the collection of data and having a database that brings all the data together really gives an opportunity around research and the potential of utilising that information. And those are all key things that are very much the heart of what Brian has done throughout his whole career in terms of his drive around data quality and access to data. And yeah, as I've already mentioned, you know, reading through some of these articles, other than the improvement in technology, it really felt like I was standing still in time, because so much of what was presented in those articles back then is still so relevant to today. So it was a bit surreal reading through some of those. And then one of the most significant new developments as a result of the database was the introduction of our MINDA system, so management information for dairy animals. And this is still a key function of what LIC provides to farmers today. And so it's, you know, and that collection of data and that more real-time access to data really gave us the ability to, you know, look into and facilitate research into genetically inherited traits. And that access to data really significantly enhanced the animal evaluation model that was in place at the time. And Bevan will touch on that shortly. So really, just to finish off, Brian's legacy forever remains as the database we have today as a beneficiary of the work that was undertaken 35 years ago, and the work and the key work that he did. So real big thank you for Brian and his efforts with that. And I'll pass over to Bevan.
Thank you, Rachel. I have to say, I recognise quite a few of those photographs, and I actually remember standing in some of those computer rooms, losing my hearing. So, yeah, it brings back a lot of nostalgia. So, from a personal note, before I start this, I kind of like to thank Brian, because without Brian's support in the early years, I probably wouldn't be here, because he provided the data for my master's project that got me into dairy cattle. And he provided a lot of support for me to do a PhD in Iowa State, partly funded by LIC. And this talk starts pretty much in August 1992, when I got off a plane from Iowa State to come back to LIC. So in the start, when we started with this big project, and it was supposed to be revamping sire evaluation. So Brian had this vision that we needed to improve the sire evaluation that LIC was doing for the industry. At that time, you'll probably hear from other people later on, but we were dealing with what we call total and payment breeding indexes. These were pretty much selection index sort of measures, and they were in percentages with a base of 100. And this kind of actually rings true today too. We had cow evaluations tied to these sire evaluations by a piece of code, and I think this is the right name. I was trying to get back in my memory, but I think it was called genetic assessment. It ran twice a year, and it was written in mainframe assembler code, and nobody had any idea at that point how to fix it, or actually what would happen if it broke. And we still have systems like that today. I'm dealing with one right now. And so it was kind of a really good idea to actually get off that platform. And so Brian had this vision to actually fix the sire evaluation. And turned out to be a massive project. So our first journey was really to kind of decide what sort of technology we're going to use. At that point in history, the blup animal model was kind of all the rage, and it was the ideal technology for us to pick up, which really evaluated both cows and sires simultaneously. And when you start doing that, you start realizing that why are we just doing sires? We've got the facility here to actually change or actually update both sires and cows. And of course, Brian realised that, and some other people realised that, and this was about a year into the project, and we had to do a major change in tack. We decided that why not update everything? And if we moved from sire evaluation to animal evaluation. And that had a really major impact, because with sire evaluation, you're probably impacting maybe 100 or 200 enthusiastic people who are interested in bull breeding. When you move to cow evaluation, you're doing 15,000 farmers. You're changing the values of the cows on their farms. And so Brian was really instrumental in developing a really massive education, consultation, and demonstration of the genetic evaluation over 3 years. And that was a huge undertaking. And one thing I do remember about Brian, he was always very good at public speaking and chairing farmer meetings. The only time I saw a minor blip, and it was a minor blip with Brian, was we were in Arahuri at a really cold hall, a day like today in New Zealand, a really wintry day. And you could see that one farmer was very agitated. We've been talking about breeding, we're talking about live weight and things. So we thought we were going to get a fairly curly question about live weight, but this farmer jumped up and then, top of his voice, said, "Why are you measuring milk in kilograms? Why aren't you measuring milk in litres?" And it was so out of the blue that you could see Brian going, "What?" But within 30 seconds to a minute, he's back on track, answered the question, and everything just carried on. The other kind of cool thing about this is we had to have a major IT project. I think Sue Lane's in the audience here. And Sue and Brian made a really good team of joining both R&D and IT together to have a really big team of people working on this, and they worked really well. So the other thing that happened simultaneously was that we had put in place this payment BI for cows and sires. And it was supposed to be in a crossbreed sort of comparison, but it was really an inbreed comparison. So if you ranked all the animals, all the cows on your farm on payment BI, and you had basically a mixed breed herd, you'd find all the Holsteins at the top, the crossbreds in the middle, and the Jerseys at the bottom. And of course, that was probably not ideal because it didn't reflect the profitability of the Jersey animals. So the idea at that time was also to actually change the breeding objective. And that's when BW was born. So it's 25 years this year that that index has been with us. So that's quite an achievement. And the idea there was, Brian brought it back to what's important on farm. And the important thing on farm was profit per hectare, essentially output over input. And for animals, we settled on profit per unit of feed. And that was the birth of BW. And of course, when you start doing that, you've got to realize that you need to actually work out how much animals consume to get an idea of what the input is. And that's when live weight became important. And Brian, with the directors of LIC and some other key industry people, then decided it was important to go out and actually weigh cows. And they actually went out and weighed the number of herds to get the live weight data up and going, along with the TOP live weight that we already had. So then we went from kind of ideas to implementation. We continued this kind of massive consultation. I don't think I've driven so much in all my life around New Zealand as we did in those 3 or 4 years, talking to people about breeding. There was considerable scrutiny of the BW results because it did, at the first time, actually line the different breeds up. So the people were very interested in that. We had breeders with USA Holstein animals, and at that point they were concerned about the indexes. And primarily just because live weight and efficiency was in there, it was no longer about absolute production. But I think one of the key things that Brian brought to this whole project was his view that the science had to be independently peer reviewed. And so no matter what the political situation was, the science could always take center stage. And that was really important. So people actually made decisions about implementation based on science rather than politics. And finally, we did implement. We weren't quite sure when we actually pushed the button whether we were going to actually be allowed to implement, because at that time, the people that were concerned about some of the values for their herds had formed a concerned dairymen's group, and they were looking like they were going to put a court injunction in to stop it, but they never did. But they got their time in court later on, and that's another story for another day. And then we embarked on this massive roadshow across the entire country. And I guess I haven't seen anything like it since. It was extremely enjoyable to do, but extremely tiring at the same time. And I guess the legacy here for Brian is this project has really set the scene for what we have now. And I guess when I look back at the kind of the way Brian operated, I think it's a really good way of operating. This thing that we put in place wasn't perfect, but it was a shitload better than what we'd ever had before. So thank you, Brian.
Okay, I'll move on to genomics. So this is really a massive legacy that Brian's left behind. So Andrew was talking about 2009 in Ireland when the Irish implemented genomics. There was a lot of work before that, and we started right back in 1992, 93. And it was a collaboration, so this international collaboration that Brian brought to the table, and it was interesting going, those who know Brian had incredible files and still does it now on a electronic version, but certainly would have reports from overseas as travels. And certainly we worked at that time with Holland Genetics, so the predecessor to CRV, and obviously LIC was involved. And we also worked with the University of Liège, and we see Michelle George's there was a key part of it. So this was right back in 1992. And it really started, there was a company out there called GenMark in the US who had identified some genetic markers that increased or changed milk production, I think up to 1,000 litres or kilograms that I read back in these reports. And they were trying to offer this company up for others to buy it. And the Dutch were interested, LIC was interested as well to work together with the Dutch. We ended up not buying the company, but getting the head scientist, which was Michelle, out of it. And that really started, it was a smart thing to do, that Brian and Nanka Dendas at the same time did. And the project, which we called Milk QTL, off we went. So one of the key aspects here, you can see some old, well, actually some younger looking faces there as well. There's Doran, there's Brian in the back, Michelle, Johan, Bill Hill, Nanka in the middle there, and the late Alan Crawford, and Walter on the side. This was one of the real aspects. So Bevan's talked a bit about it from that peer review that was brought across BW. We had the same here as well. So Brian really installed this thing called science advisory boards for us, and brought in this external opinion about how we were going as researchers. And that was really important. This is from 1995. Sadly, I missed the 1994 one, which was after the Guelph one, which I've heard from those who attended, such as Doran, that was the one. It was in some incredible location that they had in Canada. We had some great locations with these SABs as well, but didn't apparently meet the level that was set in 1994. So that was the team that Brian brought together right across the world, and Bill Beavis there from the US as well. So an incredible team. Behind that team was a bigger team as well. So this, again, you can see there on some people there, Brian, to the forefront, people from Wageningen University, people from University of Liège, people from here from New Zealand had gone across. And that was the team that was brought together. And so for me, that was really important, the opportunity that Brian gave. So Rachel and Bevan both talked about the opportunities that Brian gave to those two. So certainly through this time, I had the opportunity to do my PhD and Masters. And I think it was sitting in about 93, 94. Had option of 2 PhDs that Brian put in front of me. And I'm lucky I took this genetic markers one at that time. Also, coming from an industry, well, I came from a sheep and beef background to come into the dairy industry and still be here as a legacy to the opportunity that Brian gave, and went to Massey with Dorian Garrick, and then went across to Wageningen University with Johan van Arendonk. But very much that team that we had there. Back here, certainly in New Zealand, it was really important how to implement some of this research. And at the very start, it was very much around single genes, blad, etc. at that time, and how to implement this into our breeding program. So again, Brian was very key on actually taking science and actually delivering it to actually business and industry outcomes. And Brian played a significant role in that. So very early investment into genomics. 1992 we started, 98 was the first time we actually tried to use it, and really in 2008. So that was the legacy that Brian, those building blocks that were put in place back then. So really, to finish off, Brian, I mean, the building blocks that we talk about, genomics, the database, BW, the database, Rach talks about that. We go and look at the data dictionary. It's, the structure that you put in place back there, the tables, designs, etc. Nothing's really changed. That legacy that you've got there still stays. BW holds your initials, also apparently at the time was a little controversial. Could have been GW as well, apparently, genetic worth, but certainly that was, your legacy sits there, and obviously with genomics. And it's been really interesting. You've come back into our industry in New Zealand in the last 2.5 years. You've certainly brought a lot more focus and direction back into breeding, and really engaged, I think, wider in the industry, the importance of genetics and LICs. Certainly has appreciated the input that you've had over the last 2.5 years, with also the preceding 20 or so years that you put into LIC. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Richard and Rachel and Bevan. Next up, Peter Amer is going to talk about the evaluation of breeding objectives for New Zealand and Ireland for dairy and beef.
Hello, thank you everyone. Thank you, Hadley, and of course, thanks, Brian. So I was given the topic of talking about breeding objectives, but there's a sort of a tongue-in-cheek 20 years of being thrown in the deep end. And the Wickster is one of the nicknames that used to float around ICBF and maybe still does. The Irish guys are always really good at coming up with cool nicknames, and I thought that was a great one, so wanted to bring that memory to this. So I want to start my talk by, for me, a very influential paper. It's called Breeding for Maximum Protein and Milk Fat. Bevan mentioned the payment BI. This is the science behind it, authored by B.W. Wickham, presented at the Ruakuras Farmers Conference in 1985. I've got the Lincoln College Library stamped on the side of this. I read this in my second year at Lincoln, and I was at the time wondering whether there was anything better than being a farm labourer as a career. This paper is about economic weights, selection index theory, and the value of genetic gain to farmers. So I read that in my second year, and that pretty much set the path for my my whole career. So I'm going to cover a little bit of old ground. Okay, so Bevan mentioned the BW, and I guess the bit that stick in my mind is the live weight coming in, and this attribute that Brian picked up of it's really helpful to have an international expert to come in and to take some of the heat. And Leo Demphley was, I think, did a lot of that early work for live weight, and this idea of the hired gun coming in was really useful. I'll just give you a wave when I want to go. So then after that, obviously Brian went to Ireland, and I just highlighted some words here to foster the active cooperation and support of all the relevant interests. So that was, I guess, an understatement of what was required by Brian at that time. So Andrew mentioned the importance of the EBI, and the foundation work for that was really done by Rawl and Pat Dillon. So there, the big emphasis on getting fertility into the selection decisions, which was an absolutely critical issue for Ireland. So here's another nickname. So Donna Berry was sent down. This is another legacy of Brian, is getting people to go and experience other things in other countries. So back then it was midshipman genomics. Donna Berry came down to work with Bevan to learn about genomic selection. Sorry, I'm waving my hands at the wrong time. So it tacked on to the end of that trip. Donna came down to Abacus and we worked on how to sort of breed for the beef industry and the dairy industry sort of at the same time, given all the mixture of genes. And you can see all the wonderful diagrams and maths that, that Donna came up with there. So next slide. So getting into the value, this is the bottom line, and in Brian's paper on the payment index, he worked out the dollar value per farmer way back then, and so that's something that's always been very important for ICBF. And we can see that through both milk and fertility, we've got billions of euros worth of benefit. So if you add up the value to today from genetic gain in the EBI, it's worth about 3.5 euro cents per litre of milk in farmers' pockets this year. So I'll just keep going. So then this also translates into future benefits from greenhouse gas reduction. So also a huge impact, and that's really become a big part of the story in Ireland. So next slide. So this is when I sort of come into the scene, I suppose. So quite early in the days, around 2000, it was decided there's been some initial gains with the dairy industry. Let's try and take on the beef industry in Ireland. So Jeff Sim and I were sort of brought in as the hired guns to look at the beef industry. So my first experience of international consultancy was to land in Cork Airport from New Zealand, and was taken in a taxi straight into a meeting of Breed Society chairman, basically. There was no Brian, nobody else from ICBF, and it was my job to listen to these basically pedigree beef breeders about what they thought was needed for Ireland. So every time I tried to get the topic onto something scientific, all they wanted to do was try and get from me what Brian's agenda was for mongrelizing beef breeding in Ireland. So I think Sean mentioned about always taking a positive out of the meeting. The positive I took out of the meeting was I got out of it alive. So we developed the replacement index back in 2001, and I think this is my most cited paper, which is a little bit of a perplexing thing because it took years and years and years before we made any progress. Next slide. So it was really, we developed the index way back then. And then Andrew Cromie, I guess, and a few others in the Department of Agriculture and Brian all decided that we should, or that we could get more impact if there was sort of the government was more in behind this. Lastminute.com is our nickname for Andrew because anything he wanted done always came the night before it needed to be done. So next slide. So then along came the BDGP, which was about really linking genetic gain to the support payment system for farmers. So next slide. The big thing here, if you look at the trend, the top blue line in the genetic trend graph, you can see how maternal genetic merit was tracking down, even for all the years that we had these fancy new index. And then when that index got linked to the payment system, you can see the turnaround in genetic gain. So that I think all of the years of building up a relationship with the government, the industry, etc. If you're patient, we finally got there with those indexes. So and huge, again, dollar benefits in farmers' pockets, but also critical gains in emissions, greenhouse gas emissions there. So a sort of a legacy from New Zealand was production worth and lactation worth and what the value were, you know, those things to farmers. Farmers aren't just interested in breeding, they have other sort of management decisions to make. So Brian was always very supportive of this project. I think it had 2 or 3 false starts, but finally we got Margaret Kelleher doing her PhD on this topic and came up with a culling index, or probably not allowed to call it that still, but cow's own worth, which was a tool for commercial farmers to use all the information in the database. Next. There was the sheep island thing. So Brian was very instrumental in supporting my colleague Tim Byrne doing his PhD. And part of that PhD, we decided we'd have a crack at taking a sort of different approach to breeding objectives where we used a more survey-based approach. We tried it out on the sheep farmers in Ireland, did the bioeconomic model. And this whole approach, the success we had there has really been, we've built our whole approach to breeding objectives around this sort of mixture of surveys and models. It's been incredibly influential for us and for industries where we've applied that. Thanks. So the sort of the latest experience with Brian has been having him back here, and one of the projects he's been really passionate about is the breeding cow of the future, having a look at another look at the breeding objective here. So yeah, we've used the survey approach. We're right in the thick of that. We're going to have a lot of hard work over the next few months to find the middle ground, the index that's going to work for our future. So we're just working through that, but just an update on the survey. We've got huge engagement, 470 responses. 10 years ago, we tried to do a similar sort of thing. And my lasting memory from that process is driving up to Kaitaia for a farmer meeting, and there being one dairy farmer there who I spent most of the time talking about deep sea fishing. So we've got amazing engagement this time around. I think that's because of Brian and the mana that he brings and the work he's done promoting breeding in the industry. So there's a few useful messages that have come out of that. Farmers don't think there's enough progress being made in fertility and others. Acceptance of BW is too low, and farmers really see a role for breeding in addressing environmental concerns. So that's some cool findings that have come out of that. Okay, next slide. So the themes coming through about people development. So we've got 7 people here and another 2 that no longer with Abacus that have all spent time at ICBF. Really wonderful experiences. My experiences in Ireland have been amazing. Really, really friendly people. Even the chairman of the Breed Societies were friendly after they'd given you the grilling. Also people from ICBF that have spent time at Abacus, and we've loved having them. So this people development theme, incredibly impactful on a lot of people's careers, and you've heard that from lots of others. Okay, so thank you, Brian, and I'd just like to read out a couple of things here for showing us how to lead a complex meeting with a wide range of views, give everybody a chance to have their say, and still finish on time with an accurate summary and conclusions. So thank you for that, and thank you for showing us that seemingly complex political and technical industry challenges can be overcome if you work hard, stay patient, keep listening, and keep talking. So Ireland was the training ground for Abacus Bio to take on similar challenges in many other parts of the world. And we've had, I think, more success than that than we could have ever imagined. So we owe you big time. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Peter. Next up, we're going to have Brian van Doormaal, Matt Shaffer, and then Martin Burke talk about Dad's work with Interpol and ICAR.
Thank you, Hadley. Hello, Brian. Good to see you. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about two parts. And the first part is Brian's vision and leadership for the creation and the start of Interbol. And Interbol itself was created in 1983 as a joint committee bringing together the International Dairy Federation, or IDF, with EAAP and an organization that we now know as ICAR. I reached out to Jan Philipson, who was secretary of that committee those years ago, and I had previously already read Jan Philipson's 2005 paper, which kind of highlighted how Interbol had begun and some of its achievements at that time. So most of what I have to say about the history of Interbol comes from Jan's paper. Brian's involvement, though, in Interbol started long before it was really even an idea. He was named on behalf of IDF to be part of this group A12 in the late 1970s. This is when he was at LIC, or in New Zealand. And this was a mainly European-based group, but Brian did represent Oceania there. And so it was already starting to talk about how we do things a little differently at an international level. And Brian was a true driver of the idea that to create an international body to address the issue of comparing sires from different countries and to strengthen the Interbol relationship, Interbol concept. Shortly thereafter, in '86, the first bulletin of Interbol was published. And around the same time, we had sire conversion methodologies being published, known as the Goddard approach and the Wilming method. But in 1988, it was actually ICAR that put out an offer then to host Interbol as a permanent subcommittee. So we know that that's still in place today, but that's because ICAR took that on, and Jan Philipson provided the secretariat from Sweden. At around the same time period, Larry Shaffer back in Canada had developed this new methodology for international comparison of sires that we now know is called MACE, and is still in use. The actual creation of this Interbol subcommittee in 1988 saw Brian being appointed as its first chairman. The fact alone that he was a named chairman serves as a strong testimony for Brian's leadership skills and the respect that others have always given him. The first thing that was accomplished under Brian's leadership as chair of the Interbol Steering Committee was the establishment of the Interbol Center in 1989. And after a tendering process, SLU, or the Department of Animal Breeding and Genetics at SLU in Uppsala, was the decided location to establish an Interbol Center with funding that came with it for the first 5 years before it became funded by the industry. At that time, Yorgos Banis, so I assume, Brian, you were part of the hiring committee to select Yorgos, who at that time was actually in Canada working closely with Larry, was hired as the first director of the Interbol Center. And for those of us who have been around the Interbol family for quite some time, we know that that role led by Yorgos was taken over later by Ulf Emanuelsson, Freddie Fixie, Zhao Dur, and now Tuan Rosen. In 1995, the Interbol Center delivered its first international genetic evaluations, which was only for production traits, but it was a start. And it was in Holstein and Ayrshires and involved 9 countries. And eventually that methodology ended up being improved by using Larry Shaffer's MACE methodology. In total, Brian served as the Interbol Steering Committee chairman for 13 years. The second part I want to bring forward is my personal experiences with Brian. And I was named general manager of Canadian Dairy Network when it was created in 1995. I recall being appointed as one of the 2 North American representatives to the Interval Steering Committee. This took place in Vienna, Austria in August 1997. Brian was still chairman at that time, and this was truly my first experience working closely with him. If my math is right, we shared 4 years together on the steering committee at that time. I recall those early years for which discussions were often highly technical. Can you even imagine trying to chair a committee with some members such as Jean-Claude Marcoux, Gottfried Averdunk, Jarmo Yuga, Rex Powell, Gordon Swanson, Hans Wilmink, Enrico Santos, and of course myself, all around the same table with Yorgos Benos as our director and Jan Philipson as secretary. Regardless of the topic, Brian kept everyone focused on the business of growing interval center activities for the benefit of all countries around the world. Brian, you always saw the most direct path to a desired goal and could motivate others to go on the journey with you. After leaving the steering committee in the early 2000s, Brian remained actively involved in interval open meetings and the annual business meeting. I'm not going into details, but we also know that Brian played a very strong leadership role in the establishment of Interbeef as part of the services of the Interval Center. And maybe Martin will talk about a little bit more because that's more on the ICAR side, but it is still delivered by the Interval Center. And Interbeef was a novel, very new, international genetic evaluation sharing phenotypes from multiple countries, which had never previously been done before. And as you all know, national genomic evaluation services in dairy cattle were starting to be implemented in some countries during the period of 2008 to 2010. I recall very clearly that during interval meetings, Brian would regularly express his opinion of the need for an international service to exchange genotypes between countries. As a consequence, at the ICAR interval meetings held in Riga, Latvia in 2010, the Interval Steering Committee agreed that Interval must facilitate the exchange of genotypic information. And we started simply. Let's start by just sharing a list of bulls that are genotyped in each country so we could reduce the expense of regenotyping the same animal multiple times. At that time, an urgent need for standardizing the way genotypic data and file formats were established was also identified as a high priority for both Interval and ICAR. Through Brian's involvement at the ICAR level, a review process of the various ICAR committees took place in the mid-2010s. One outcome of this review, which was led by Brian, I believe, was the creation of the new DNA working group under ICAR, which happened in 2016. And Brian and Martin came to me and asked if I would become chair. So I had another opportunity to work closely with Brian again. Through this collaboration between ICAR and Interval, the GenoX PSC service was officially launched in 2018 for the international exchange of DNA genotypes to facilitate parentage verification analysis conducted in several countries globally. In my heart, Brian, I truly believe that the GenoX platform and its associated services is another example of how your vision and the ability to motivate others, myself included, even though you weren't even right there beside me, has changed the world of cattle breeding and genetics. As you know, Brian, Brian also has his own company, Consult Wickham. As one of your projects, Brian, I recall you were hired by a group here in Canada to conduct an assessment of the structure of the beef industry here. While it's taken several years since that report was tabled back here in Canada, Your recommendations for the creation of the Canadian Beef Improvement Network, or CBIN, is now also becoming a reality, Brian. So thank you for that. Brian, some personal words. I've always known you as a person that gets things done. I'm sure that someone at Nike must have been witnessing you somewhere in action before they came up with their very famous slogan, just do it. We all have had very passionate people, very visionary and passionate people around us. And you're truly one of them, Brian. The big difference, however, is that throughout your career, you've been very successful in also converting vision to reality. We thank you for that. And I thank you for your leadership and your friendship over the past 25 years. I'll pass it on to Matt.
Thanks very much, Brian. And firstly, thank you for inviting me to speak, and for Brian to have taken us back through a bit more of the history that I unfortunately wasn't there personally for. And it's a pleasure to speak on behalf of the Interball community. I think we've seen that Brian has a long and deep connection with Interball and its service users. And thank you again, Brian Van Doormaal, for reminding me what large shoes I try to fill. I'd like to make just a few points about Brian's ongoing contribution and a few personal reflections. So I first met Brian in 2008 in Cork at the World Holstein Friesian Federation conference. And I can remember, Brian, you were one of the early speakers and you got a few curly questions and I went, what's going on here? And that was my first introduction to the politics of breeding in Ireland, and I found it fascinating. So a few years later, I came back through and I met you again in Cork after you'd been working through ICBF. And that conversation had a lasting impact on us here in Australia, because that really helped us shape how we set Datagene up. And I can remember Brian and consultant Wickham came to my office in Derry, Australia, and you wrote a paper for us on a central data repository, and that became the foundation for what we've since done. I think those legacies are a testament to your vision. I also worked, Brian, with you when we set up the World Breed Federation's working group within ICAR. And then when I joined Interball for the steering committee, I've worked with you over the years. And I think for me, the last few years of your role with NZAEL have been some of the most interesting, because I think we've explored far too many common problems, solutions, and ideas. And that's been quite important for us. As we've heard, I think it's been an incredible globe-spanning journey with Brian, and on behalf of the Interball community, I would like to thank you for your active contribution to the world of animal breeding. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Hopefully you can see. So Brian and all, it's a pleasure to take this opportunity to share with you all what you all know already. But what really is amazing is that while Brian was sorting out New Zealand, Ireland, New Zealand, at the same time, he was having a huge international impact. So we talked about Brian's vision and his dedication to science and getting people to stay on track and bringing everybody with him. But one aspect is that the man's engine was absolutely huge. So the amount of work he could get through while, straightening Ireland out, and again, New Zealand, it was also, those countries were getting the national benefit, but there's a huge international benefit as worked through, as Brian says, and as Matt pointed out in Interball. Look, he has been an outstanding leader on the international collaboration of cattle breeding. I had picked 3 or 4 photographs. I could have 20 from each conference we had on here. I just picked the 2012 one, where obviously it was crucial for Ireland. We have an Interball slide in the middle. Chile 2016, just to show that it's not just about Europe or Oceania. We're trying to cover all people. And when Brian's strength was bringing everybody along. And sometimes, people like myself who are a bit maybe not as emotionally intelligent would say, look, we got 80% of it. He said, no, everybody has to come on. And he really made everybody feel included, whether you're a small country like Ireland or whether you're United States or Australia. So the strength of the international collaboration. Way before my time, Brian mentioned the IDF group right from late 70s, early 80s, right through to the Interpol Committee in 1988. But also then Brian, while he was running other jobs, he was also vice president of ICAR and the board of ICAR from 96 to 2000. I just showed the last slide the last picture at the bottom there. In 2018, we had the WC Galp World Congress in Genetics and also ICAR together. There's nobody else on this planet who could have managed to achieve that, and the politics involved in it, but we still delivered, and we managed to have a very successful conference. So the ability to bring people along and keep them going internationally was fantastic. I suppose he's also prepared to step down into the trenches when it needed, despite, later on in life, he could have said, okay, I'll stay at the top table. No, he helped set up Interbeef as Brian van Doormaal and Andrew commented on, but he drove and he brought countries along. And as Brian van Doormaal says, sharing phenotypes, you can imagine how hard it is to share data, but sharing phenotypes is doubly hard. And to bring, 13, 14 countries with not a huge amount of resources to share beef genotypes was a testament again to Brian. And he's left that in a very good position for Andrew, and who now continues to drive it on. The picture on the right shows Victor and also some other chaps that were there from India in 2012 in Cork. And this just reflects that, again, he's really including everybody. And the bottom two are where he's helping me particularly as a groups coordinator for ICAR in the last 5 or 6 years. So himself and myself have worked very, very closely for 20 years. I would not know anything about breeding, only I had a tremendous mentor in Brian Wickham. And he has been a fantastic servant to us up and down the chain in ICAR. This picture, thanks to Jappie van der Westhuizen, is from, I think, Prague. And it shows, some of the long history well before my time of two players there that were in the ICAR president on the right, Hans Wilmink, would have been a fantastic colleague of Brian way back with Interpol and beyond. And also Milan Zalic, an ex-minister, but an ex-ICAR employee as well from Slovenia. And look, Brian had respect and worked with these guys way before my time. And I think from now on, look, it's about the next generation. And here's a picture, I think you had it as well, Hadley, of the team. But Brian, as a team player, always was a fantastic asset. And everybody in ICAR had only good things to say about Brian as a go-to person, and treat them with respect at the level. And he was never, ever too busy to talk to anybody. So on behalf of the staff, Brian, we really want to thank you. And finally, I guess it's now up to the next generation to take the microphone from Brian that he has really, really utilized so well. And this shot of him walking out of a working group, I think in this case it's the complete board and chairs meeting. But Brian has left us in such a good place that we have only one way to go, and that's up. So thank you for that, Brian. But I'm on my one last slide, and I'll send this on to. This is also from Yappie. It's a fantastic picture of the team that is the Wickhams. I didn't have Hadley and Charlotte in this picture, but these guys founded something special and delivered it not only within countries like Ireland, New Zealand, but right across the world. So Brian, thank you, and really appreciate the work. So appreciate the time. Hadley, I do have one other thing to recognize Brian. If I could rob 5 minutes, I'm going to ask Andrew to say a few words. We had a good conversation, myself, Andrew, and others of your peers, Brian, and some of your students. We wanted to do something for the future. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen and I'll share another one. So Andrew is still here, which is good. So Andrew, I'll hand it over to you if you don't mind. Thanks very much for.
And so much of what has been talked about in the previous presentations has been about Brian's role in terms of fostering linkages between different groups and countries, and with a particular focus on young people. So this is an idea. It's a move beyond an idea, but it's from working within ICAR, Interpol and Interbeef. It's the Brian Wickham International Exchange Program for young people involved in animal breeding. So maybe next slide, Martin, please. And look, there just a wee bit of the context here. These are the conversations that we end up having, either over a beer or a coffee. It's an increasing challenge, you know, the next generation of animal breeders. It's just becoming an increasing challenge for us all. And we all know that Brian has been such a long-term and highly committed advocate of collaboration. And he's also passionate about young people development. And the ironic thing is that within ICAR, Interbull and Interbeef, we really have a unique network of organizations working collaboratively for the future benefit of livestock farmers globally. And the question we've often asked ourselves are we leveraging this network enough in the context of our young people? And we believe we aren't. So a few of us, as I said, have put together this initial program with the objectives to establish a young people development program within our membership, our ICAR, Interbull and Interbeef membership, that will enhance the knowledge and skill sets of young people through international exchange, but in doing so improve the services that we offer global livestock farmers in the future. And the second objective in establishing this is to really acknowledge the foundational role that Brian has played in helping to establish national and international collaboration in animal breeding. Just some of the details we're working out. It's an annual exchange program. It's going to be facilitated by ICAR, Interbull and Interbeef. It's going to focus on employees, young employees, but also potentially young graduates, not yet in full employment. We'd like to see this grow to a target of 5 or 10 people per year coming together into this that year's exchange program. An initial focus on genetics, but in the discussions we've been having, people are pointing out, well, what about our herd recording people? What about our IT? What about our database people? So the program will really involve the identification of common interest areas between our countries, the identification then of suitable young people, and then establishing sabbatical periods, you know, between members that will facilitate the exchange and reporting and presenting back at the outcomes by those 5 or 10 people at our annual meetings. And look, it's like anything, we walk before we run. We've learned that from Brian, but we have a vision here, but there is still a lot of work to be undertaken in this in terms of its governance, T's and C's, how we select people, application, all of that sort of stuff. But what we have agreed on is an initial pilot program, which we're going to look to kick off in 2022, involving a number of countries. And these are the countries that at this stage I've been able to reach out to and are prepared to put their shoulder to the wheel in terms of this initial pilot, to identify common interest areas, to identify young people, and to start to get them moving around our relevant countries for a period of time. So in Ireland, we have ICBF in Chagas. We have, you can read them there, in New Zealand, Australia, and US, Canada, and also the Netherlands. So Brian's lasting contribution to cattle breeding, Brian, we you know, this is looking back in Cork. It's a packed room. It was a hot day. Lots of exchanges and opinions, but with a common goal as the outcome. And I mean, this was your endearing legacy, Brian, was that vision. But also, and to Brian van Doormaal, others have picked up on this. You know, it's the commitment to put the vision into action. And I think the link here is that within our Interbull, our current Interbull and Interbeef and ICAR group, we also have this vision around the young people development piece, but we haven't yet put it into action. And we really believe this is our opportunity. It's the opportunity to acknowledge and to say thank you to you, Brian, and to really establish this Brian Wickham International Exchange Program for young people working in animal breeding. And that this hopefully will be one of your foundational legacies and contributions to our cattle breeding industry for years and years to come. So Brian, thank you very, very much for that.
Thanks, Andrew. That's just such a lovely idea in keeping with the things that Brian values so much. And thanks to Martin and Matt and Brian for giving some of the Interbull and ICAR history as well. So next up, I'd like to welcome Cherilyn Watson, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the LIC database, particularly in support of the breed societies.
Cromie. My name is Cherilyn Watson. I'm General Manager for Holstein Friesian New Zealand, and I'm also the current World Holstein Friesian Association President. However, today I'm here to speak to you on behalf of all the dairy cattle breed societies and working with Brian Wickham to achieve a breed society solution to integrate to the Dairy Industry Good Animal Database, or DGAD as we call it. Yep, there you go. Back in the late 90s, I first met Brian when we worked in offices on opposite sides of the corridor. Our interaction at this time was minimal, often just a quick hello as we passed in the corridor. Then one day the office was empty and I heard Brian had headed off to work in Ireland. Fast forward to January 2019, and Brian was back in New Zealand, taking on the role as NZAEL manager. At this stage, from a breed society perspective, our solution to DGAD was nothing more than it's going to happen at some stage, but no one knew when or how. Several ideas and suggestions had been put to the industry stakeholders, but were all rejected. Early on in Brian's tenure as NZAEL manager, I met with him to discuss the breed society integration to DGAD and how a TOP solution could work alongside this, as long with some other ideas that we had for to move the project forward. Long term, there was not an option for the breed societies to continue to work as they currently were throughout the LIC database, as once CRV were independently sending data to DGAD, there would be information gaps. I was firmly of the belief that breed societies could not just wait for something to happen, but had to drive their own destiny and find a solution. From this discussion, and with the support of Holstein Friesian New Zealand Board and Brian, the idea grew, and we revisited the options previously put to industry stakeholders. Working with Brian, we quickly settled on an option for the breed societies taking over, running and providing a TOP service to the industry and linking this to traditional herd book services provided to breed society members. The plan was for breed societies to operate from a secure area within DGAD where data required would be used for prescribed breed society purposes and TOP. Working across the industry with Brian, we gained stakeholder approval for this solution, and finally the breed societies had a plan and were on their way. Next step, how was this going to be funded? After much discussion about how a solution would work, what it would cost, and how a small group of not-for-profit organisations were going to realise what was required. Holstein Friesian New Zealand set out looking for ways to fund the project, and through contacts at MPI, it was suggested that an application be made to the Sustainable Food, Fibre and Futures Fund. In July 2019, Holstein Friesian New Zealand applied on behalf of all the breed societies, and with Brian Wickham's help over the next 6 months, provided information required by MPI and answered many, many questions. In late December 2019, on only a day before Christmas, Holstein Friesian was advised their funding application had been successful. At the same time as the funding application process was taking place, Holstein Friesian New Zealand, on behalf of all the breed societies, engaged Resolution 8 to assist the management of this project. I can do many things across my roles, but IT was definitely not one of my strengths. With Brian's support and vision for the solution, the breed societies worked with Resolution 8 to draft out the requirements document to the solution, and once finalised, this document was put out for tender. In October 2019, following the tender process, Rosea Systems was engaged as the vendor, and the breed society TOP solution began. At this stage, a governance committee for the project was also formed, and along with representatives from Holstein Friesian New Zealand, Jersey New Zealand, Rosea Systems, Brian was part of the governance committee from day one, provided great insight and feedback all the way through the process. With all the necessary contracts in place, the building of the breed society and TOP solution to DGAD commenced in May 2020. The project was divided into 8 milestones, and the birth of the Breed It solution commenced. The first milestone saw the platform for the collection of TOP developed and launched in September 2020. New mobile devices were purchased along with new program to collect data for the first time in the 2020-21 season. At this stage, the TOP and Breed Society administration milestones had not been developed, so the remainder of the season we used the legacy LIC screens. In the 10 months since that launch, the 7 other milestones have been developed and support the TOP function and Breed Society services. Alongside the development of Breed, the negotiation process of accessing data required for the Breed Societies has also been taking place. Brian has assisted with this discussion and provided Breed Societies with guidance to ensure their requirements are met. In the next week, it is expected that Breed will go live and the Breed Society TOP integration to DGAB will be complete. While the process of accommodating Breed Societies and DGAB has not been straightforward, I believe with Brian's learnings and experience, we have found the best possible option available. Over the last 2 years, Brian has provided incredible support and guidance to Holstein Friesian New Zealand on behalf of all the Breed Societies to develop and build the Breed It solution. Brian talked through ideas, helped form solutions or answers to issues, and then followed through to make sure it happened, also facilitating discussion across a wide group of industry stakeholders to achieve an optimum outcome. Brian gave both me and Holstein Friesian New Zealand the confidence to see that it was possible and empowered us to ensure that the best possible solution was found. On behalf of Holstein Friesian New Zealand and the Breed Societies, I would like to sincerely thank Brian for his incredible contribution and support. Personally, I'd also like to thank Brian for his encouragement, always being available to talk things through with me and answer at times my innate questions. Thank you, Brian. I have really appreciated your guidance and support, and it has been a pleasure working with you.
Thanks, Cherilyn. Next, I'd like to invite John O'Sullivan and Michael Doran, who are going to speak about ICBF from the farmer's perspective.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me, Hadley?
Yep, we're good.
Okay, very good. Right, my name is John O'Sullivan and I'm a dairy farmer from near Cork City here in Ireland. And the first time I saw Brian Wickham was up in the Midlands in a hotel called the Hudson Bay Hotel, where Brian was giving a very interesting presentation to a lot of people that were interested in cattle breeding on what he saw as the future of cattle breeding. Now, I'm sure that Ireland is no different to anywhere else in that cattle breeding from a farmer's point of view can be a very emotive subject. And I can tell you that there was no better person to start it up than Brian Wickham when he came to Ireland with the vision that he portrayed. So I had the good fortune to be involved in the board of ICBF. I was its first farmer chairman before Michael following me, and I was chairman of the organization for 12 years. And, you know, I suppose we've had some fantastic presentations from people that represent people who are scientists in the animal breeding world, from organizations that deliver the work of the scientists to the farmer down on the ground. And I would just like to take the opportunity maybe to say a few words on behalf of the farmer, and in particular the farmers here in Ireland, who are the beneficiaries of the work that Brian Wickham and people like him and the people who deliver those services out to farmers. And I would have to say that it was an absolute pleasure to know Brian Wickham and to work with him. But I have to say, early on in my time as chairman, he made an observation to me that scared the living daylights out of me, because, well, I partly guess what I was in for, but when he observed to me that, you know, John, very often it makes more sense to seek forgiveness than to seek permission. And I suppose that really outlines Brian's modus operandi. Brian had a vision of what needed to be done. There was no deviation from that. If people disagreed with him, yes, he accepted the disagreement, but he would outline why he disagreed with them and quote all the facts and figures to back up his point of view. And of course, Brian was right. You know, there were a lot of us, I suppose, who had difficulty in seeing the bigger picture, but Brian always knew what the bigger picture was and never deviated from setting out to achieve that. And, you know, he brought the very most of us along with him, and we are the beneficiaries of that today. I think from my point of view, I would say that most certainly the launching of the database, and in particular the development of the EBI index, were massive. And if I could just relate a little story, I suppose, to illustrate how the EBI would have affected dairy farmers in this country. Some few short years before the advent of the EBI, on this farm here, we had very extensively used two very high profile French bulls at the time. And we were milking a lot of cows by those two bulls. In fact, we were milking 52 daughters of one of those at one stage. But there were two very different bulls. One of them bred the milkiest cows that I have ever put clusters on, and an incredible ability to produce milk. But the result was that they lost condition of the body, and you put in a bit more meal to try to keep the condition on them, but they just converted that into more milk and proceeded to lose more condition. And a problem very much associated with that was that they were a nightmare to get back in calf, a nightmare. And the other bull that was used, maybe not quite as much production, but absolutely plenty of it at the same time. But you inseminated them and they were in calf. And, you know, we were asking ourselves the question, why is this the case? And we were, I suppose, at the end of a period where all indexes were production driven alone, because there was no way of measuring fertility at the time. And the advent of the database and the EBI index changed all of that when Brian could see that what farmers needed was something that was going to breed them a profitable animal, and that quite often that most profitable animal was not necessarily the highest producing animal. So, you know, time constrains me from saying an awful lot more, but the one thing I think about Brian Wickham that I will say is that he always measured every proposition. He measured every scheme by asking the question, is it the right thing for farmers? Because he knew that the farmers were the ultimate customer, that if the farmers didn't get something that was going to improve their lot, there was no point in he trying to do what he was doing. So I think that what is right for farmers was his was what he operated by, and I think that has been proved to be very, very successful for him. The other thing I would like to say is that he had a great ability to select good people. He selected great people to support him in ICBF, and the very most of them are there today. And, you know, it was going to be no good he going in there and doing a good job if he didn't have this ability to recognize talent and to incorporate it into the organization. That he did. So, Brian, I would say that my minutes are, or Hadley, my minutes are up. What I would like to say to your dad is that on behalf of all livestock producers in Ireland, and in particular the dairy farmers, if I may say so. You have done us a great service. We really appreciate what you have done. And the most important thing that we can do, you know, to protect that legacy is to make sure that the invaluable resource that you have given us in the database and everything that flows from it is protected into the future and is continued to be operated under the principles that you established day one when you set about setting up ICBF. Many thanks, Brian.
Thank you, John, and good evening to everyone. Michael Doran is my name, and I'm going to share a few views of from a beef farmer's perspective around my first engagements with ICBF. And the first one that I engaged with ICBF was around 2005 or 2006, when I was asked to join Herd Plus. Tom Egan, a beef specialist with Chagas, and John Shirley from the Farmers Journal asked me to sign up, and I done so. And the first thing I remember getting from ICBF at the time was a calving report, and I read down through the various KPIs, and calving interval jumped out at me, and it said, you know, I had a compact calving spring and autumn herd, calving over 9 weeks for each of them, but it said I had a calving interval of 435 days. So I was a bit alarmed at this, and obviously ICBF weren't as good at calculating figures as I was told that they were going to be, because definitely my herd wasn't that bad. Subsequently, the following year, got a similar figure and a similar calculation. And I remember meeting Brian somewhere along the way, and expressing my thoughts on ICBF's knowledge. So after listening to a young opinionated beef farmer, Brian quietly, in his direct approach as always, said, well, maybe Michael, you're not as good as you thought you are, and I'll get Andrew to look at it and get back to you. So off I trotted, and Brian was correct. I was rolling over empty cows from spring to autumn and autumn to spring. And the minute I stopped that practice, farm profitability improved dramatically. My next time, and Sean and Andrew touched on it, was I was at an industry meeting sometime around 2007, not too sure when exactly, when Brian explained he was going to introduce a single index to compare all beef breeds. Well, I can tell you all hell broke loose, and I quietly agreed with the view that it was crazy and impossible challenge. How could you compare an easy calving Angus, early maturing breed, to the likes of a beef breed such as Charolais or Belgian Blue? And at this stage, ICBF were very much seen as dairy focused organization. You know, so this was seen as just an impossible task for people that didn't understand beef breeding. But I suppose Brian's vision and wisdom proved correct. The Suckler Beef Index, as the guys talked about earlier, was launched and done what Brian said it would do. It's been tweaked a lot over the years, and we have a terminal and maternal index, as Peter Amer pointed out. But the foundations Brian laid back then stood Irish farmers well. And today, when a guy is selling a bull, the first thing that most purchasers will ask for is the tag number, so they can log into the database, put in the animal's number, and see what the indexes of that bull is. So, you know, I suppose Brian's resilience always amazed me. And after many what I thought were very difficult and challenging meetings, you'd speak to Brian afterwards, and his view was always how wonderful the meeting was and how everyone had agreed with him on a certain point. But if it was me, I think I would have been packing my bags and heading back home to New Zealand, because, you know, some of those, they mightn't have verged on abusive, but they would have been quite very heated, and robust exchanges would have taken place. But Brian listened and took what he felt was the key points that he wanted to take to drive what the direction that he felt that we needed to progress in. But I suppose luckily for us, and crucially for us, Brian didn't head back, and those foundations that Brian laid back at the start of ICBF were so solid that it's enabled us to continue to build on them. And this is Brian's lasting legacy, in my view, to Irish livestock farmers. His vision and his wisdom has left us with a database which 100,000 livestock farmers contribute to today, with every animal in the country on it from birth. And Brian showed us crucially that limited funding was not an excuse to stop work or stop developing. Today, there's over 120 billion rows of data in that database. But crucially for us, it's farmer owned and controlled, for the benefit of all farmers, with genetic gain at or above any other country in the world, with Irish farmers breeding the best cows for the Irish industry and within the Irish industry. So thank you, Brian. We will always be indebted to you for your vision of cattle breeding. And thanks, Hadley.
Thank you, John and Michael. And then next up, we have Mark Townshend, who's going to talk about how he's seen cattle breeding change, develop in New Zealand, and his vision for the future.
Good morning in New Zealand and good afternoon around the world. I guess, Dorian, you and I have still got the late shifts, so the time is 8:50. Can you just give me a reminder, 8:57, so I'll make sure I stick to my time. I'd really like to acknowledge Hadley for organising this event and acknowledge Brian and Alison. And maybe it's really important that we acknowledge Alison, because when people are going through some of these tough fights, it's often the support people that end up carrying quite a bit of the load. Delighted that Brian, Alison and Alison are going to become grandparents. I was a bit worried about Brian's fertility BV, but he's going to get quite a step up. I don't have any PowerPoint presentations. I'm still irreparably damaged from sort of 10 years in industry governance, and when PowerPoints first became a thing and people seemed to be able to fit as many in as they could and thought more was better. So in talking about Brian, I'm going to sort of break it up into before Ireland and after Ireland. And so my first experiences with Brian were in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was a time, I think, when genetics held a higher standing in the industry than what it is today. And I can't really explain that, but there was a lot of farming leaders that took on governance roles. And I'm talking about people like Dudley Lane and Jim Thwaites, David Bay, John Murray, Owen Roundtree, and people that held a lot of industry positions, and they had a real interest in genetics. And on the management side, the godfather, I guess, was Jeff Stipcher, who seemed to be around forever. And there were a couple of rising stars, and Bevan and Baron Harris we heard this morning, and Doran we'll hear in a minute. But the two impressive guys in the 80s and 90s for me were Brian Wickham and Harvey Tempero. And I guess there was a time I was still full-time underneath cows and hadn't really been involved in industry governance roles. And I probably assumed, along with many others, that Brian would end up with the top genetics job in New Zealand. Didn't play out that way, and I don't mean any ill will to Glenn Whitaker, and I'm sure he did a good job. But sometimes you go through a door and you have to turn left or right, and when you go through the door, you can't turn back again, and then you go to the next door. And I can't help but think that, how would things be today if we perhaps got another 10 years out of Harvey Tempero and through the introduction of genomics, and if Brian had taken on the top role here in New Zealand. So I never really saw Brian for another 20 years, but I had a pretty regular and constant contact with Irish farmers, Mike Murphy amongst them, and several others, and it was pretty common to have a conversation, say, oh, how's Brian getting on, Brian Wickham getting on, with trying to revolutionise some genetic change in Ireland. And I'm pleased to say, Brian, those comments were always affirmative. So now skipping forward to 3 or 4 years ago, and New Zealand Animal Evaluation Limited had a farmer advisory panel, and I was on that. And I think it had an important role, but it just felt like NZAL was drifting. I mean, I think there's some issues around not quite enough cooperation between NZAL and Dairy NZ, and after Bill Montgomery's retirement, you know, Jeremy Bryant was a fine young guy, but he was feeling his way without a lot of support. So I think that when Brian bypassed retirement to take on the role, NZAL really grew a leg. It really shifted up several notches. About 9 months ago, I was asked to take on the chair role of NZAL. I've got a family and a wife that telling me that I'm too busy and I should be slowing down. I didn't really need the job, but I took the job on for 3 reasons. One, that I thought we could do better for all New Zealand farmers, and that always needs to be the test. What's the best interest of New Zealand farmers? I had a commitment from Jim Vanderpoel that Dairy NZ would support NZAL, and I could not say we couldn't have asked for any more support than we've had from Dairy NZ while we've been going through some changes. And the third one was that Brian was steering the ship. And so Brian has really shown a high level of professionalism, and he's certainly dined out on his experience in Ireland, where amongst plenty of wins, there was plenty of headwinds from time to time. And so one of the things that Brian was involved with, and I were NZAL involved with, is we set up a genetics forum last November. And out of that, we set up an industry genetics steering group, which consists of the chairman of Dairy NZ, the president of Federated Farmers, chairman of Fonterra, chairman of Tatua, GM of New Zealand Dairy Breeds, being Cherilyn, chairman of LIC, CEO of New Zealand, CEO of CRV New Zealand, and myself. And so, Brian, I'm going to give you a bit of a present today, because last night the industry genetics steering group met, and we unanimously resolved that we've got a way forward to bring the genetics section of New Zealand dairy industry closer together. We've got plenty of hurdles to get over around commercial arrangements and access to data and things like that. So there's a lot of devil in the detail, but I think it was really quite a milestone that a lot of the people in leading positions in New Zealand dairy industry last night reached a unanimous agreement that we've got a pathway forward. So with that, I'd just perhaps like to close with a couple of things just on a human approach. So when Brian was discussing his current predicament and working his way through it, in Brian's normal way, he had a pragmatic approach, and this is what he's going to do. He's going to make the best of the circumstances, and he made some comment that if along the way, if science can, in helping me, can help other people, then that's a great way of doing it. And so I think that probably summarises Brian the person. And it reminded me, just in preparing this today, on Friday night, Diane and I attended a book launch in Te Puke. A guy who used to be our solicitor and good friend, Ross Underwood, who was diagnosed with Parkinson's about 25 years ago. And the way he took on that fight to fit everything he could in his life, and it's getting a tougher fight all the time, but he's done really well. And I was preparing a note for a funeral about 12 months ago about a guy who had terminal cancer. The guy rented a house off us. I had nothing really in common too much with this guy, apart from he rented a house. He was a reformed alcoholic. He wouldn't have been in the same meetings that I was involved in. He would have voted another way. he would be one of the people I respect most in life, and the way he took on adversity, and he took a 6-month prognosis and turned it into 3 years of really good fulfillment. So sometimes a lot of good things come out of adversity. So with that, I'd just like to, on behalf of NZAL, and NZAL is a subsidiary of Dairy NZ, which represents all New Zealand farmers. Brian, I'm just not sure that anybody's made a greater contribution to genetics in New Zealand than you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And to finish things off, Dorian Garrick's going to speak to kind of the whole of Dad's career from 1975 to 2021.
Okay, thanks, and good morning and evening, everybody. I have the privilege of having known about the scientific work that Brian has done for at least 40 years, and I've had the privilege of working very closely either with him or for him for about 35 of those years. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how Brian changed the world of cattle breeding. So I'm going to start a little bit earlier than Hadley was suggesting, back to J. Lush, who started at Iowa State in 1930, and in 1932 published the book Animal Breeding Plans, the first textbook about animal breeding. And it was very much a big picture description about how breeding would be done and all of the aspects of it. And he introduced some key concepts like how to predict genetic gain based on the key equation. And he communicated a lot about the concepts of index selection. He had many PhD students, but two that are of interest to us at his time at Iowa State. And one of them was C.R. Henderson, who immediately after the war started his PhD in mid-career and graduated in 1948. And the other one was A.L. Ray from Massey University, who overlapped at the same time with Dr. Henderson. And Dr. Henderson zoomed in on the theory and application of prediction and variance component estimation. That's heritabilities and correlations. So a much smaller focus than Lush's animal breeding plans, which had everything to do with genetic improvement. And he invented the mixed model equations, a form of which I show you on the right-hand side, although he didn't know matrix algebra at the time and didn't use that kind of notation until much later. He only ever had one sabbatic leave from his time at Cornell, where he started immediately after his PhD, and that was to New Zealand to collaborate with Al Ray and to jointly spend time with the Dairy Board Farm Production Division. He did that in 1955 and worked closely with somebody in the Dairy Board called Shale Searle, a farmer's son from Taranaki, who showed Dr. Henderson that the mixed model equations he'd invented were best linear unbiased predictions. Okay, next slide, thanks, sorry. Having a bit of trouble here advancing the slides. So then Shale Searle went back to Cornell and did his PhD. He graduated in 1958, and he focused even more narrowly than Henderson had on the proofs that underpin prediction and variance component estimation. And he built on the foundation of first proving that the mixed model equations were BLUP, which, although they were discovered in 1955 during Henderson's time with the Dairy Board, weren't actually published until the landmark paper in 1959. And after that, he got a bit tired of the Dairy Board in Wellington and went back to Cornell in 1962, where he was on the faculty for many years after that. Thank you. So why am I bothering to tell you all of that ancient history? Well, the reason is right down there at the bottom is that Brian did his PhD at Cornell with Henderson and Searle. So Brian Wickham was right there in this time where Lush's concepts had narrowed down to Henderson's mixed model equations, to Shale's proofs. And Brian did his PhD on sire evaluation using selected records. So one of the critical considerations at the time was, could you evaluate animals correctly when there was a whole lot of selection going on? So when the only cows that were measured in the second lactation were the best ones that had been in the first lactation, could you do those things properly? And that was the subject of Brian's PhD. And many others followed the steps to Cornell after Brian and Alison's initial footsteps there. And the one that immediately came after them was Robert Anderson. And Robert Anderson arrived in '75, and he sent me an email the other day, and I thought this was kind of interesting. Shale Sill had a very explosive personality at times. And Robert said to Shale one time, several weeks ago, you told me you couldn't understand the Coughlin paper, very important paper in the statistical area. And he said, I now have some idea, and I thought a numerical case might provide some further insight to explain to Shale this paper. And Shale said, what the hell do you think you're doing? I had high hopes for you, but appears you are just another computer Nick, like many other students. I suggest you pack your bags and take your wife and children back to New Zealand. Now, I put that quote in there both because it shows Shale's personality, but it's also a kind of statement that followed Brian in various other parts of his career when there were suggestions that he should pack his bags and his wife and head back to New Zealand as well. So that's kind of where I would think about things. And I worked on BLUP. And so I would be considered, I guess, a BLUPper. So the mixed model equations would be, to me, perhaps, the very heart or the hub of animal breeding. And I've put them there in the center of that circle. And people like me, at least in our early time, just took it for granted that surrounding that hub were other activities that were well looked after, like pedigree data and herd testing and reproduction and research and a breeding scheme and a business proposition. And that BLUP that I might consider to be the central aspect would represent the process where data from somewhere is manufactured into information to support some decision. So that was my view of the world, but that's very different from Brian's view of the world. So despite the fact his PhD was on sire selection, he was really the center of a hub, which he basically demoted the actual genetic evaluation part. I've called it sire evaluation rather than BLUP because BLUP didn't develop in New Zealand for at least another 15 years after the time that Brian came back from Cornell. I've put Brian in the center there, but Brian's a pretty humble person for those of you that know him. And you may have heard some of the things that he's been doing. The focus on all of his activities was never about Brian. So I guess to give you an analogy, you could think of Brian as being the composer and Brian as being the conductor, but he wanted you to listen to the music the orchestra was presenting rather than focus on him himself. So while he had a whole lot of activities in LIC, where I put him in the middle of the hub there, and then at ICBF and Interball and so on, they were never about him. They were about that concept of changing data into information. So one of the interesting issues was that he had this impact on farm profit, or at least in the early days, we talked about it for farm profit. Now we're a little bit more general in talking about whether it's good for farmers, because some things can be good for farmers without necessarily being about farm profit. So the milestone for measuring whether you should do anything was about whether it should be good for farmers. And I think that came up a number of times in the talks this morning. So think of Brian in the middle, the hub of this wheel. This wheel needs to be in balance. So if any of the spokes on that wheel are weak, then the wheel will wobble along and go from side to side. We need it to spin truly. And if some of the spokes are longer than the others, then you're going to have a bumpy ride. And what I believe Brian did a lot for the science of and implementation of cattle breeding was to make sure those spokes were all aligned. And so you have to concentrate on the ones that are the weakest part of it. And those various sire evaluation, herd testing data, reproduction, research, breeding scheme, business proposition, interval, they are all part of the spokes that Brian worked on. And in his early days in New Zealand, coming back from Cornell, I think he identified that there were several weak spokes. One was the lack of a national database, and so he was instrumental, as you've heard, in putting that together. Another one which you haven't heard any talk about is how important it was to use bulls widely. And in order to use bulls widely, you had to have good semen technologies. And to get good semen technologies, you had to study things like conception rate. And by creating a database that recorded all of the mating and other events, allowed LIC to mine that data and come up with ways to extend bull semen to make more cows pregnant. And that all rode on the shoulders of the database systems that Brian put in there. Another important point was finding elite bull mothers. And Brian was instrumental in using bull mothers that came from commercial herds, not necessarily registered animals, as long as they had 3 generations of AB mating. And that had a huge impact on increasing the rate of gain in New Zealand. And of course, international collaboration. Okay, so get that wheel spinning. So Brian, right throughout all of the activities that I've ever been involved with him, he has done 3 things. He started off by always acknowledging where is it we are up to right at the moment. And there are lots of other people around the world that do that. They point out the things that are wrong with where we are right at the moment. So they think about where we are. But the second thing that you need to do is, which not everybody does, is then identify and communicate where you want to be. And Brian has done this right from his early stages. And lots of people do that too. They identify where they are and where they want to be. But Brian has done the third thing as well, and that's to decide and to orchestrate everything that you need to get there. And then repeat the recipe. And he's repeated that recipe. He's designed the spokes of that wheel numerous times at LIC, at Interval, at ICBF, and then back again at NZAL. So through the 1990s, he was involved in further refinement of the database, the development of the crossbreed animal model, the BLUP system that you heard about from Bevan, the development of the national breeding objective, which came about from having a crossbreed evaluation that Peter Amer has talked to you about, and then the development of microsatellite markers and searching for QTL, the MIL QTL project that Richard Spelman talked to you about. And he's had to add many more spokes to the wheel, and that wheel has gained more and more inertia as time has gone on. And now I've shown you that there are 2 Brians in the middle, because now he was achieving twice as much as he was before, because as he got this wheel walking, he then got it to be running. And you'll also notice that I haven't changed the picture of Brian in there either, because as I've known him over his career, his haircut's changed once or twice. His glasses have changed a few times, and he might have shed the tie that he used to wear all the time in his early days, but he's pretty much looks much the same for all the 40 years that I have known of him. So I recently read this little note on something that Brian had communicated to me, and he was talking about data sharing, and he was saying, the model for data sharing gets right away from the currently and totally impractical model with every service user having a data supply and access agreement with every other service user. And although this was written in a recent context, it's something that I think has been a critical part of Brian's thinking right back from the 1970s. This was the concept that led to the LIC national database concept of bringing together all the data. It's what he then put in place with Interball for sharing data between all the partners. It's what he did in ICBF, and it's again what he has been promoting through NZAL. So something else hasn't been talked about so much. Brian has always been an early adopter of technology and organisation, and those of us that worked with him in the early days will remember every meeting had a folder and it had color-coded numbers and so on, and you had to struggle to walk down one of the halls at LIC because the corridor was full of a bookcase with all of the folders from all of these meetings that he had in the past. But he very quickly moved to digital systems as that method became available. He was one of the first adopters of the cell phone, one of the first people around to use a laptop, and to use it for doing more than just looking at your diary and the time. He made widespread use of email, rapidly adopted word processing, and I can't think of any other person that has sent me a document in Word that has used more advanced features than Brian. So a lot of people, you know, they hit the space bar to indent something and they type numbers in, and Brian was using styles for headings and automatic table of contents numbering and recording of document sources, all of those things for a long time. Same with spreadsheets. He had spreadsheets would have data filters and mail merges and those kind of things. And his online meetings, links and document cloud-based filing systems. Brian jumped on anything that would improve system efficiency and all of the things that he was working on. So then Brian went to ICBF late 1990s, and you've already heard that it was a blank slate. There was not much there, a very fragmented breeding sector. And Brian rapidly reinvented the next generation of what had been his New Zealand activities. So I think it might have been easier for him that the organisation was fragmented, because it had just allowed him to very quickly come in place and create all of those spokes that he needed. And now you'll notice there are 3 Brians driving that, because his ability to get all these things done with the new technologies was so much more, having the experience that he had up until that time. He kept adding more spokes to the wheel, a focus on education and training. So there weren't too many adequately trained scientists in Ireland at that time. He had to go across the border to Northern Ireland to get Andrew Cromie, the first scientist he had on his team. And then he very actively worked to promote education of PhD students within Ireland. And although he did go to other places to get people like Victor Allori, I think from Edinburgh, and Thierry Pablou from France, he has a very impressive team of Irish-born and bred PhD students that are now scientists in the organisation there. He did more collaboration nationally, collaborated with animal traceability and abattoirs, probably all part of his original vision that he might have had for New Zealand. Also collaborated internationally, both within Europe and elsewhere, and included beef, cattle and sheep, which I think were probably also things that he'd had in mind when he originally set up livestock improvement database systems in New Zealand. You know, that was a vision that was around when herd improvement was renamed as livestock improvement as the database was first being created. And he did all that creating an industry good business from the information system that represented all of those activities. There are a whole lot of other very useful Wickham attributes that he's brought to the world of cattle breeding. He's always been prepared to put up a straw man as a starting point. No point having a meeting where there's something to start discussion about. He's always been prepared to change to any new justifiable direction. So if somebody can suggest that something he's doing is not the best way to do it, and he accepts their view, then he will rapidly change. He's always been prepared to try something that's promising but is as yet unproven. I have never been to a meeting with Brian where there hasn't been an agenda where there hasn't been all of the documents you require to consider the issues, where there hasn't been minutes afterwards and action lists and follow-up items. And those of you that have been involved recently with them in NZAEL will know often it's only 15 minutes to half an hour after the meeting that we receive the complete draft minutes from that meeting, because he's been typing them while we're on the Zoom meeting. In fact, it's often been quite annoying when he hasn't muted his microphone, because you hear all the clicking of his little fingers on the keyboards. And he's been very good at getting everybody running on this treadmill. This wheel is like a treadmill, and he's been orchestrating everybody on it. And he might start being the only one on it, but he seems to be able to encourage everybody else to get on there with him. And before long, there's a whole team which makes the wheel move much faster. And he's even been able to reduce the number that try to run in the other direction on the treadmill, either because they've fallen off the side or because they've decided that the direction everybody else was running was the right way to go. And you might wonder, with all of these things that he's been doing in work, you know, what happens at home? But he has still found a lot of time for family and to do his share of home handyman activities. You might not know that while he was involved in a whole lot of NZAEL activities, he was renovating the house in Hamilton and making major structural changes. And a lot of the changes he made would be ones that professional tradesmen would be very proud of. Brian's world in retirement, he established a consultancy business, and he worked as Secretary General for ICAR for a little while, and some consulting activities, including assisting NZAEL with dealing some opportunities and challenges. And when he looked at the things that were challenges there, that led to him doing what was more or less full-time work, but probably much more than full-time work. The LIC, the New Zealand information system in Brian's absence. So in that time that he got that wheel up and spinning at LIC, he went away and got that wheel up and spinning at ICBF. What had happened in New Zealand? Well, the first thing was that some of the industry goods spokes on that LIC wheel had been lost, and some of the roles had been passed over to Dairy New Zealand. But the Dairy New Zealand NZA wheel had not really been spun up. So yes, it had a database DIGAD. Yes, it had an evaluation system, which was basically the old LIC one, but it hadn't been going around the circuit of the spokes and making sure there were balance and all of those kind of things that Brian has been so good at. So Brian's world from 2019 onwards, this part-time activity helping out NZAEL was really achieving the work of about 4 people, looking after the transfer of that DIGAD database, which hadn't had all of the functionality added to it, as you heard earlier. So making sure that that extra functionality got added to it so that data from breed associations and CRV could come directly into DIGAD rather than via LIC. Developing an open and transparent system of animal evaluation, what has become known as NZAEL 3.0 and NZAEL 3.5. 3.0 with the pedigree-based systems will be becoming live in December, where all of the traits have been revamped, and 3.5, including genomics, planned for December of next year. He's been a very strong supporter for greater adoption of genomics in many aspects of the industry and a driver of innovation in all aspects of the information business. So Brian's NZAEL legacy, he's spun up the NZAEL wheel in a very, very short time. And you can be assured, Brian, that keeping it spinning is in safe hands, but it's going to take at least 8 of them to look after the ones that your pair were doing. So Ted Coates, Dave McCall, Cam Nielsen, and myself have taken over various parts of the roles that Brian was doing directly, and we will make sure that thing just keeps on running. So changing the world of cattle breeding, Jay Lush established the science of animal breeding. Henderson invented the statistical approaches to animal evaluation. Shale Searle brought logic and proof into computational methods and discipline into his students. Brian Wickham put the D of R&D into livestock systems alongside and in balance with the R part. Brian Wickham did not just change the world of cattle breeding, Brian Wickham defined the world of cattle breeding, both nationally in the 1890s in New Zealand, then in Ireland, and globally via ICAR and Interbull. Thanks very much, Brian.
Thanks, Dorian, for that lovely summary of Dad's career. Now I'm going to turn it over to Charlotte, my sister, to sum up, and then she'll turn it over to Dad for a few final remarks.
Hello, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Charlotte Wickham, Brian's daughter, and it's my pleasure to wrap up the conference. I want to start by thanking all of the presenters. This wouldn't have happened without you. And it means a lot, particularly to Mum, Hadley, and me, who have always been a little bit at arm's length from exactly what Dad does when he goes to work. You've each provided insight into some aspect of Dad's work, and I think even those that have worked closely with Dad have learned about some part of his work that they weren't aware of. Hadley deserves a big thank you for organising everything, from handling the registrations, sorting out the technology side of things, and wrangling all the presenters. And also thank you to RStudio for providing the Zoom webinar account that's powering this all behind the scenes. I want to also echo Hadley's thanks earlier and thank everyone who is here today, particularly everyone that left comments on the registration form. It's meant a lot to all of us to read those comments. And then, of course, I guess the biggest thanks, and why we're all here, goes to Dad. And I want to talk a little bit about a project that Dad helped me with, which is completely unrelated to anything to do with cattle breeding. And this project is tiny compared to something like setting up ICBF, but I think highlights just some of the Dad's personal attributes that I most admire and have made him so successful in his professional life. So to set the scene, this is about 10 years ago. I was a grad student in Berkeley, California, and my husband and I had recently bought a Volkswagen van. And our little project was building a drawer unit for that van, somewhere just to store things out of the way when we would go camping. And Josh and I had made a start on this project by the time Mum and Dad arrived for a visit. We had a plan for this box. We'd borrowed some power tools from the city tool library. We'd cut the materials up and started assembling it, and it hadn't gone well. The cuts were rough, nothing was square, and I think we'd basically given up. Like, this half-finished box was a complete embarrassment. And this is where Dad enters, and I think this is where you might recognize the parallels with Dad's professional work. Dad looked at us and this box, and he recognized that we were basically capable of building it well, but there were two big problems. One, we were missing some key skills, and two, we were being hindered by substandard tools. To keep a long story short, Dad took us off and bought a new circular saw, solving the tool problem, and then worked with us on the box, teaching us as he went, until we had perhaps not a perfect, but at least a workable drawer unit. The van is long gone, and we've got significantly better at carpentry. We now have a room full of tools, but that circular saw that Dad bought still gets plenty of use. So while we're focused today on many of Dad's concrete achievements, I think much of Dad's legacy are the things that he's taught us and the values he's instilled in us. So from me, but I think also many others, thank you, Dad, for recognizing and believing in what we're capable of, for your patient teaching, and giving us the tools we need to reach our potential. That's all from me. I'm going to hand this over to Dad to close the conference.
Thank you. So there's hardly a dry eye in the house at this stage. I've prepared some notes for what I was going to say, and there's a risk of course, repeating things that have already been said. So I've got it down to a special thanks to, 2 points I wanted to make. The first was the personal messages that you've sent me. Charlotte and Hadley have both commented on those, and I greatly appreciate them. But the point I wanted to make is it just shows the spirit of the community that I've been honoured to be part of during my life. So that was the first point I wanted to make. You're just such a fabulous community to be part of. The second, and I was struggling with this word overnight, but Charlotte's given me the what I needed to justify using it. And it's really a thanks to my family and close friends and my wider group of friends. And of course, that includes pretty much everybody that's here today. Between us and with a lot of help from others, we've taken more than a few wrecks. And it was this word wreck that I was a bit bothered by, of wrecks of of one form or another. So Charlotte's analogy was very helpful here, whether it's a house or it's a whole industry that needs a bit of work doing on it, and turned them into something that we are now proud of. And I think that's what I sense in this. The presentations, we've all got to a point where we're proud of some of the things that we've done. So that's the final thank you. We've done this by Zoom, and here I'm going to place an obligation on the next generation. Next time we meet, or one of you meet one of my children or their partners or spouses, that there's an absolute obligation to have a drink. And the first one's going to be on us. So thank you. And with that, I really appreciate everything that's gone on here this session. Thank you.